Wow, 1,000 subscribers? I didn't think I'd make it this far. Time to talk about the S118! Our story starts in Australia during the Second World War. Queensland railways were feeling the strain as the Japanese were growing ever closer to the mainland, and the need to move troops and supplies was pressing the existing MOF power fleet to its limits. In 1941, a request was made for more C-17 class 480s, one of Queensland's reliable and stalwart designs. However, because of wartime, these requests went through to the United States, who took the 480, threw it in the trash, and decided a 282 of similar proportions would be better. They also threw this in the trash, and from scratch designed the S118. At the time of construction, many railways, especially in Asia and the Middle East on narrow gauges, lacked motive power, and Queensland's need for a 480 had inadvertently brought the machine needed to life. The S118 could be considered as one of the world's first universal designs for the locomotive, as the class was operated by many railways on 3 different gauges during and post-war in numbers not seen until the diesel era. They had a 9-ton axle load, and as far as American designs go, they were built to fit smaller loading gauge railways quite well, and like their larger S200 cousins, designed to burn both coal and oil with easy conversion between the two. The only issues that stifled this worldwide design was though they could run on 3-track gauges, converting the engines to a different gauge after assembly could be a bit complicated. All engines were optioned out, depending on railway, with steam brakes, Westinghouse air brakes, sand equipment, and any type of coupler you wanted. They also featured fairly large cabs and updated springs for riding over possibly war-torn trackage. The S118s, like the S200s, found themselves in British theaters of war, as they provided a good middle ground design between the War Department Garretts and smaller engines already employed by railways the locomotives were sent to. Now, I don't know where else to mention these, so I figure I'll throw it here. The S118s had a partner in crime from the War Department. Sort of. Sudan Railways had ordered a batch of 462 Pacifics in the 1920s. They were a rugged, simple design, and for some reason the War Department decided these would make a good 3-foot-meter Cape gauge wartime design. This was not the case, as when the engines were built, nobody wanted them, favoring S118s over a light Pacific, which, let's be honest, is not a great idea for heavy wartime traffic. The vast majority ended up in Sudan, who was more than happy to have a new batch of their old favorite, with their rest remaining in knockdown form storage until after the war, when some were picked up by the Western Australian government railways to become their U-class. The S118s, meanwhile, proceeded to go everywhere, and while I would love to go into detail about the batch that was waiting to be shipped to Japan if we had a land invasion, I'll limit it down to countries and locations where they were long-lasting or played important roles. Only 11 were made 3-foot gauge. These were all sent way up north to the White Pass and Yukon Railway, where they proved semi-popular. The WP&Y didn't like their tenders, nor did most outfits who ran them, because in true fashion, every USATC design has to have some flaw, which for the S118s it was their tenders, which at speed had a tendency to bounce and skip around, causing derailments. The WP&Y kept engines 190 to 197 after the war, and their tenders were swapped with those off the 70 class engines. Of all the S118s, I admittedly find WP&Ys to be the worst looking. I've never been a fan of a high headlight plus stovepipe chimney, which is what the WP&Y did to these engines after they gained ownership. Queensland Railways, who started this whole mess, got 20 for their Cape gauge system. Them being the ones who initially discovered the problem with the tenders, it's little wonder that they also pulled a tender swap. The 282s gaining older tenders off retired and scrapped QR power. In Queensland, the S118s were known as the AC-16 class, for American C-16. They also gained the nickname of Yanks, for reasons I probably don't have to explain. Speaking of names, the S118s are the only US-built Mikados to unofficially, or maybe officially depending, not be referred to as Mikados. It was wartime. Mikado was a Japanese word, and historically had been used to refer to the Emperor of Japan. So instead, the S118s became MacArthurs, named after American General Douglas MacArthur. This is an interesting topic in itself, as several US railroads also tried to change their Mikados to MacArthurs. The Union Pacific going as far as writing General MacArthur a letter about how all their 282s were now named after him, which the general seemingly thought was interesting, but didn't really seem to care. I bring up the name as this was the name used the most by the 68 S118s that went to the Royal State Railways of Siam in Thailand. To me, these are the best looking examples of the class, as it's pretty hard to beat the green boiler jackets, occasional white wall driving wheels, and the yellow trim. These engines were also some of the longest lasting, serving into the 1970s as wood burners and even working on sections of the famous Death Railway alongside C-56s imported to Thailand during the war. The largest number of engines went to India, where the majority of them started their life working heavy trains on the Bengal and Assam Railway in far western Assam to haul supplies to cut off the Japanese march toward India. It was not uncommon to see a pair of S118s double-heading a 100-car supply train, or be found on one of the B&A's steeply graded sections giving a helpful shove to a Garrett on an equally long train. By the end of the war, the S118s would be scattered all across India on the meter gauge system, and they would remain as part of the new Indian railway system, originally in the role of mixed traffic engines, but slowly new YGs would bump them to more minor roles, most often working at the bigger meter gauge stations to bring passenger stock to and from the coach yards, and usually would be in a more run-down state with a lack of headlight. An amazing 301 engines were still on the roster in 1975, which included a 33-locomotive batch of Baldwin post-war copies from 1948. By the early 1980s, as India started to ditch non-standard power, the S118s were on the chopping block, but there was a small holdout, as the Northeast Frontier Railway, what had once been the Bengal and Assam, seemingly still loved these engines. They'd always rostered more of them than any other Indian railway zone, and even into the 1990s they still had a couple for switching duties before steam ended on the NFR. Africa too saw its own small influx of S118s, with the likes of Tunisia, Algeria, Nigeria, and Ethiopia rostering S118s, though the standout is the Tanganyika section of East African Railways, as while the engines were acquired post-war from Nigeria, they proved to be a reliable machine. Their light axle loading made them a welcome addition on Tanganyika's lightly laid branch lines, but their real party trick was the ability to run on the Kigoma and Mapanda lines after heavy rains, where 3-foot deep water would flood the sections of track, and the S118s with their high fireboxes could surmount the floodwaters no problem. The other notable mention for Tanganyika is they outshot the last S118, literally, as EAR and H2717 was outshot by the railway in 1953, the locomotive presumably built from remaining parts of 2 Nigerian S118s. After the war, these locomotives would continue to bounce around to places like Peru and Honduras. Copies were built for Greece. Burma and East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, worked sizable fleets into the 60s and 70s. In fact, here is a handy map to show just how far these locomotives got in the war and post-war service. So, preservation then. To American enthusiasts, the most well-known S118s are White Pass 190 and 192. Both are operational, though both run at theme parks, with 190 living at the Tweetsie Railroad and 192 living at Dolly Parton's Dollywood. Australia has 2 surviving AC-16s. The Zigzag Railway in New South Wales, after a long time shut, rosters AC-16-218 with her replacement tender. This engine is on my bucket list as I want to see her working up those grades. And Queensland Rail maintains AC-16-221 as part of their heritage steam fleet. These are the only operating examples, although a handful survive between India, Myanmar, Burma, Greece. In fact, all of the copies in Greece survive, although all are in scrapyard condition minus 1, and a few in South America, although for a class of engines once so numerous, less than 20 of these engines now survive. The S118 is interesting, to say the least. They're a humdrum Mikado, another throwaway wartime design. Yet they went to more of the world than the S160, and in countries like India even outlasted them. They're definitely among my top 5 favorites when it comes to steam locomotives. Now, when can we repaint one into RSR livery again? Thank you all for watching, and thanks for 1,000 subscribers. I'd like to do more of these hit a milestone talk about a favorite thing video, so the more of you subscribe, the closer we can get to 5,000 in the next one. Perhaps I'll talk about a certain Central American railway system. But for now, once again, thank you all so much. And now we can resume and head toward the next episode of Forn's Theme Crash Course.